Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Mindshack. Mindshack is an African podcast focusing on leadership, society issues, and psychology from Africans who humbly aim to be African leaders across the continent through doing hard things. My name is Jean-Claude. I am Zimbabwean born, currently based in South Africa, and I am joined by
Lethabo from South Africa.
All right, so please continue to give us feedback. Your feedback is our fuel as we set sail on this journey in discovering and establishing Mindshack as a podcast. So within our episode today, we're going to be discussing the LGBTQ community in Africa. So we've kind of decided to bolster the way we're going to talk about this topic by bringing on two guests. So it's kind of a special episode. We have Nigel. Nigel, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
What's up, everybody? My name is Nigel. I'm an incoming second year at ALU, and I'm going to be studying computer science, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Nigel, quick question. Why did you decide to be here?
Because I feel like there's a lot of conversation that we need to have as Africans about people in the LGBT community and where they stand and how we can support each other. And I feel like the best way to start this is by having as many conversations as we can amongst ourselves and between our friends to just make it more of a thing that people are aware of and that people talk about in their day-to-day lives, if possible.
Okay, awesome. Also, we're joined by Arize. Arize, if you can please introduce yourself.
So my name is Arize. I'm from Nigeria. I just graduated from ALU with a degree in business management. I currently work at Facebook as a product content strategist. As a person, I'm deeply passionate about tech, entrepreneurship, and LGBTQ rights. So I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, awesome. So essentially, these are two people that are passionate and have done their homework as a result of the passion they have in the space. So yeah, we brought them on because they also sort of have some projects and things they've been a part of within that community and space that would be like great to dive into their perspectives and sort of their journey within this community and space. So without further ado, I think I'm going to go into kind of giving a little brief background. Before I do that though, I thought for a second we should do a round robin. So we're just going to go around the circle, go through every single letter, and quickly define it. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go with L for lesbian. That's two females who are attracted to one another.
G, which stands for gay, which is two men who are attracted to one another, either romantically or sexually.
And then I'll go with B, which is bisexual. And bisexual essentially refers to people who are attracted sexually and or romantically to men and women or to more than one gender identity.
I'll go with T, transgender, a person whose gender identity differs from their assigned sex at birth.
Q, that's queer. From my understanding, that is a person those are the explorers, I believe. People that are sort of figuring it out.
I think what you're referring to, JC, is questioning, not queer.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, because queer can be kind of thought of more as an umbrella term, but that's a whole other discussion and can kind of differ depending on whose side and what kind of person you're talking to, based on whether or not they feel that the word queer is can still be considered as a slur. So moving on from Q to I, now if I'm not wrong, I should be intersex. That is someone who was born with more than one distinct sexual organ, right? So then, yeah, that is essentially it. I mean, you can kind of differ because then you could take that into the realm of identity and whether or not someone identifies as being both male or female, which does technically fall under the umbrella of trans, but given the complication of having both male and female sexual organs, that's again like a whole other matter that you would have to get into a lengthy discussion about.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think A is just like Q in the sense that it has two different meanings. So Q stands for queer and questioning. A also stands for asexual and ally. So asexual essentially refers to people who do not experience any form of like sexual attraction and are generally not interested in sex at all. And allies are, straight heterosexual human beings who have associated themselves with the queer movement.
P, pansexual, a person who is attracted to all gender groups.
Thanks for clearing up Q, by the way. I really appreciate that. And for the listeners. K is kinkiness or kinky. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that right?
What? Huh?
Wait, am I wrong?
I'm not aware of that.
I'm going to be honest. Well, I don't see myself as like an authority or, like the most extremely knowledgeable person on the breadth and the scope of the LGBT community. I really doubt that someone having a kink places them or qualifies them to be within the LGBT community. Because I know a shit ton of straight people who have the weirdest fucking kinks, and they are not, in any sense of the word, LGBT.
Look, you're making me think twice. Are you saying that K is not kinky, or you're saying you don't know how that fits in the story?
Yeah, because I haven't even heard about K as like
exactly
being LGBTQI acronym. This is honestly the first time that I'm hearing of K.
Same.
Because like I think if we're referring to it as like kinks, heterosexual people have kinks as well. So every human being that has kinks, exactly.
But then, sorry to have cut you off there, Arize. But then doesn't that speak towards the idea of the movement not like trying to include everyone and trying to have people realize that the movement is about equality? Because look it up, K is like part of the whole story. So that's where that comes from. It's like, I believe it comes from essentially getting people that are heterosexual to be part of the movement.
I mean,
but correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say that the thing with associating kink, or like adding the K to the entirety of the acronym, associates a certain level of sexual deviance, right, to some extent, with the community as a whole. I don't mean to say that sexual deviance is wrong. In fact, I mean, I've done my research just now. The K actually is part of the acronym itself, but it is important as well to think about the fact that the LGBT community is not only within the breadth of sexual attraction and like wanting to have sex, or like like being able or being allowed to choose who you want to have sex with. It also has to do with your rights as a human being and your attraction, not necessarily sexual, but just your attraction, period, and being able to express this attraction to different members of society, regardless of bias and discrimination, which is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, that's quite true, the way you put that. So, I mean, guys, this is a moment where it feels like, first of all, when I did the research, I was a little late into like catching up with everything. I've like out of the norm ways of finding out things about stuff that's not necessarily in line with what I might know on a daily basis. So I was a little late on figuring this out. So from when I started to learn the full story, the K part was already part of the story. So it's kind of normal as part of the research that I did too, to have seen that. So that's how I've just like thrown it in there among people that are very well and experienced in the topic, and they're like, what? So anyway.
And so like, I just want to go back to something that you said, I think when you're explaining the K and like how it's part of the LGBTQIA thing, because I think you said something around how, the LGBTQ movement is about equality, and you perceive it as, the K was added to include the heterosexual community and like get them to be part of the, of the movement, right? You said something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So I just want to clarify that, like, I don't think, including heterosexual people or like finding like creative avenues to include heterosexual people and people into the community is what the LGBTQ movement is about. I think it's more about advocating for the rights of sexual minorities, and these are these are people who, whose form of like sexual expression or like sexual identity slash gender identity strays from the norm. And when I say the norm, I'm talking about heteronormativity and the whole cis and gender construct, right? So people who stray from that are the people who are part of the LGBTQ community. Having a kink or like having a sexual kink is a form of sexual expression that is agnostic to whether you're straight or whether you are queer, right?
Yeah.
So that in itself cannot be a basis for, being included in the queer community. Because when, for example, like when a gay person is talking about the systematic oppression that they face in their in their communities, where sometimes like they can't find jobs and sometimes they're outrightly killed, somebody who has a kink cannot tell that story. Do you get what I mean? Like it's like nobody would oppress a human being for having like a sexual kink or like deny them a job because they have a sexual, like that's not how we roll, right? So like I just want to like clarify that. But yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I don't think I'd said it yet. Like for me now stepping into this, it's like there's a lot of like unlearning. It feels like a lot of like thoughts, almost like conscious biases that just need to be, at least for my position, like shaken off. And I hope I see some kind of group of people that are similar to me. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that. It also kind of spoke to what I was going to pose as the first question. I was now starting to think like, I think it started as LGBT or a lesbian, gay fight or movement at the beginning. Has it grown just particularly because it's trying to include more people that are falling within sort of type of person that fits this movement? Is that the main reason that it's growing?
I think it's more of just discovery and like learning, right? Because I think the concept of sexuality was, or like the study of sexuality was, I think, minimal at best, half a century ago. So there's still like a lot of like exploration in terms of like sexual, of sexual identities and like the different queer identities. Things like pansexual and like the difference between pansexual and polysexual was only like a fairly recent discovery. And like as people learn more about the different sexual identities, they add more things to to the LGBTQ acronym. But I think we're finally at a point where even though it's extended, there's there's a reason why the plus is there, because the plus essentially covers everything else. And I think that plus is very symbolic in terms of it acknowledges that there's still going to be more things that are going to be added, because there's still going to be more sexual identities that we're going to discover, right? So as we add those things, they would kind of like fall under this plus thingy. So I think I think the more dominant acronym is LGBTQ plus.
That makes sense. So now to speak to the actual movement, I kind of want to have an understanding. I mean, I have an understanding that I'm going to add on, hopefully, with either one of your answers. Nigel, I'm going to give this question to you, if you don't mind. I kind of want to get a little foreground, set a little foreground of where the movement is right now and why the movement is almost, I want to call it, such a almost tough movement. Like the road ahead is tough.
All right, so to answer this question, I'm gonna kind of split it into two different points of view. I'd say that the first is from, say, the inside looking out, rather, or like or the outward facing aspects of the movement and how the community as a whole is existing as of right now. And then the second part, I will have to talk about how the community is like on the inside, right? And I'd have to admit that I am not the most read person, right? A big part of my experience and knowledge on the LGBT community is from a very personal knowledge and knowledge that comes from my own growth. Talking about the community as a whole, facing outwards, I would have to say that we have gotten to the point where it has become common knowledge, right? That the LGBT community exists, it is varied, it is wide, etc., etc., etc. There is less to do with surface level knowledge or surface level awareness. And now I think the focus is especially on legislation, which is especially on understanding nuance within the community, which is especially on understanding boundaries and specific things. And a lot of the time, these specificities can be taken to be unnecessary complications by those who don't understand why they are there. You would say that, oh, LGBT plus is enough, right? And a funny mockery, actually, I say funny with air quotes around it, because honestly, it's very disrespectful, but often the term the alphabet club I have seen get used quite a bit.
Yeah.
I doubt I have to explain why, but of course, it's simply because, you know, there are a bunch of different acronyms, a bunch of different letters. So it's like, oh, wow, they're going to end up using the whole alphabet at this point, right? And it is understanding, I feel like the main issue now needs to be getting legislation to pass, right? To get into the point where our lawmakers can understand that these are the kind of laws that need to set in place. And not because, and you know, and not simply because it has to align with their personal beliefs, but because it is in the interest of protecting the lives of people who are openly identify with these labels, right? Because as much as you want to say that as Africans, right, the LGBT community does not align with our religion or our culture, despite despite that being an actual lie, given the breadth of information we have on the past and how intrinsic homosexual culture was with our community in the past and our kingdoms and stuff like that. At the same time, the argument of misalignment with our culture cannot stand when there are people whose lives are at stake, people who are killed and, you know, assaulted, and whose lives are at danger daily because of our lawmakers' refusals to set up laws that protect us, right? And if anything, and then it's like a weird way, because if you know, you could say that, oh, you know, they could also just pass it straight, they could not be so flamboyant about it. And at the same time, there are some of us for who not being able to live out who you are, right, within the case of people who are transsexual, that can be very damaging to their mental health, right? And that can actually cause them to have to then be dependent on medication, or have to constantly consult a therapist, right? And it becomes this thing, and that again is tied into our culture as a continent and as individual countries, and how we view mental illness, and how we view and the importance that we give to mental wellness, right? So that's like a battle that has to walk hand in hand. So yeah, that's the most that I can say and that I can give about the community facing out. Now, within the community itself, there, at least recently, has been a lot of friction, and I think there will continue to be friction because of how deliberately inclusive the community is, right? Because while it's a good thing, it can also be a bad thing, right? Because then you will have, say, a misunderstanding of certain classifications, or a misrepresentation of certain groups, or people co-opting things that, you know, are technically I wouldn't say belong to others, but are restricted towards other groups. And it's this kind of constant conflict between different groups that cause a certain level of friction. So an example I would give is the recent rise, I would call it, in the existence of bi-lesbians, right? Now, I think just from saying that term as a whole, I think you'll be able to understand how bisexual lesbians are not actually a thing. They simply cannot exist. You cannot have a bisexual who is also a lesbian, right? Now, from my own research, I found that what this actually means, right, the actual term that people are trying to get around to is oriented around the fact that they are bisexual, right? They can and do have sexual attraction towards men, women, and or more genders, right? So they are romantically biased towards women, right? So under that understanding of the difference between romantic and sexual attraction, the actual term for them would be something like homoromantic bisexual, right? It sounds like a weird, like scientific term, but that is the specific way that they would be referred to under the model that they tout as where they're getting their understanding from. Now, the issue with that is that instead of, you know, taking the time to explain their standpoint and explain themselves, it gets to this point where it's almost like a dogfight back and forth, where constant groups are spitting just bile at each other and constantly arguing simply because this one group of people will not, say, take the time to explain themselves and where they're coming from. And it is honestly justifiably, and the anger of their opponents, people who are lesbian, who are feeling validated by the sudden co-opting of a term that is not theirs and is honestly disrespectful to them, is understandable, because you have you and friends of yours who are constantly hypersexualized by the media, by the porn industry. You have movies made about you that are not necessarily representative in the best way, or say maybe kind of pedophilic. You know, like the lesbian community as a whole has been through a lot, especially given that they're women and naturally drew the shorter end of the stick within society, and then having to deal with being part of the LGBT community as well. You have this whole cultural understanding of how much you guys have fought to get where you are, and then you have a whole other group of people who, if you think about it, like someone who's bisexual could pass for being straight simply by dating a man, right? People who have the option and the comfort of luxury and not being directly attacked and being discriminated against, coming in and trying to co-opt a term that you have fought for so hard. And you would see kind of where these kinds of frictions within the community take place, right? And this is like these small kind of like battles or like guerrilla fights you see in so many different places. You have the thing about the bi-lesbians, you have a bunch of stuff to do with zoophiles and pedophiles, and how like they keep trying to co-opt themselves within the LGBT community, despite the fact that these are things that do not qualify and are honestly held within extreme contempt by members of the community itself. And then this all then comes back to the main point of how the LGBT community was founded and is built upon inclusivity and compassion and empathy for others who are struggling with you, and yet is then makes it very vulnerable and very able to be exploited by people who would otherwise choose to come in and try to create a safe space for themselves when they don't necessarily deserve it, or do not necessarily have a reason the safe space because they are naturally privileged within their societies, right? Or something that is, say, like pedophilia, which is morally, you know, and justifiably to some repulsive, right? So then it's this thing where how much inclusivity is a good thing, how much of the how at what point can we say, all right, this is enough, we have, like, we're inclusive, yes, and you know we want to be there for everyone, but there's only so much that you can do, there's only so much that you can be inclusive of before how much you're being taken advantage of comes into play, right? And it's these two specific things that tend to say explain the entirety of the LGBT community at this standpoint. I'd like to welcome Arize if he has anything to share or like correct me on, because again, I'm not like the authority on this kind of stuff, but I'd like to say that I have a certain amount of understanding of things.
Yeah, I think you're pretty spot on. Like, I think you covered, you know, most of the things that I had in mind. I think the only thing I'd want to add is, I think where the queer movement is now, and I'm speaking more culturally and culturally outside of the LGBTQ community, is in the sense that there's a lot more visibility to the queer community as a whole. And I'm speaking like, so not just in film and like music, etc. I'm speaking about like even in our daily lives. I think we're starting to see it's like a period where people are becoming more confident, to be themselves and like to accept themselves and to be open about who they are. Because I think I was reading this news letter a couple days ago, and essentially the guy was talking about how people tend to disagree with things that they are distanced from. And so once, like, it's a lot easier to hate something that you consider as other, that isn't, like necessarily within your physical space. Because I think looking at like my own experience, I typically had like a bunch of, homophobic friends. But I think as soon as I came out to them, they now, I think, went through like a period of reckoning where they were thinking about everything they had said in the past, that might have come across as offensive. And they actually now started to be deliberate about unlearning a couple of the things that they thought that they knew about the queer community, because for the first time in their lives, the queer community was not something that was out there, that was being demonized, or something that was within not just their own space, but within their own heart, right? And and I could force them to essentially like open themselves more to learning more about the community. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that. And I think this is something that is transposing to like film, and we're seeing a lot more representation of diverse queer identities in like in film. So like as people see more of themselves on screen, like they're able to find the language to articulate who they are and like what they are experiencing. So that's definitely like a step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there's quite a bit that's been said. Generally, I'm someone who likes to I want to take it like chunk by chunk, sort of dissect it in smaller bits. So I'm still following, because the way you've explained this is really expansive, and it feels like it takes a few I feel like I'm gonna have to listen to this again in order to fully understand on the level some of the things you spoke about. But like Nigel, at a point you spoke about culture in the African context. I feel as though you also sounded like you're speaking towards culture, the African context, not necessarily being a reason to being like ignorant. The information's there. People are just not somewhat making the effort. So I think like one thing that's sort of come into mind for me is that, like, okay, so in some research I did, I'm learning the legislative and governmental policies that exist are obviously part of the issue. So it's part of the issue, and people aren't buying into what might get the movement forward. It almost feels like it's a minority movement in the, at least in Africa's context, right? And it almost feels like not enough people care enough to, like, in Ethiopia, those research that was done by, I think this research company is called PSB. They did a survey, African youth in Africa. So in Africa, right, obviously. So in Ethiopia, they found that more than 76% disagreed with there being a need to do more to protect the rights of LGBT. So for me, that just sounds like people aren't they aren't educated and aren't even bothered to be educated about why this movement would matter to anyone that's outside of them. So I'm gonna end this off with a question. I wanna almost pose two questions actually. One, One is going to be like on a personal level, touching towards Arize's experience coming out. You sort of highlighted points of it because of your circles and how they felt and the reckoning you said they had to go through. In your experience, right, as they were going through this reckoning stage, and you had this like coming out phase and impact, like a lash out, call it, of like maybe the way people thought of you and how that might have changed. What was that? If you can speak on a different lens to what you spoke of, people within the reckoning, what was that like experience like on your personal level?
Right. So I think before I even get to the experience, I would touch on like my logic of like coming out. And I think so. So like I'm mentioning that to clarify like how exactly I came out and why that led to how it affected me. So I think when I thought about coming out, it wasn't it's like it wasn't like it wasn't a thing of like, oh, like I'm going to make this public announcement about my sexuality. Like I always knew that it was just going to be the people who I genuinely cared about and those who I felt needed to know, and that was my family and my friends, Stephanie. So that was so so like those were initially the people who I earmarked to come out to. And how I came out wasn't a thing of like, oh, here's me, this is what I am, and I would really appreciate it if you could stay in my life. Like that wasn't how I came out. It was like, so this is a part of me that you didn't know existed before, but but this is me now. The full picture, and I'm telling you this not for your approval, but like I'm telling you just for you to know, and you can do with that information whatever. Like whatever you want to do with it. So you can either choose to leave my life if it's too much for you. I would not hold you back, and or you could choose to stay and go through the process of educating yourself, because in as much as you're my friend and you're my family, there are certain things that I would not tolerate from anyone. And like I think it's like the slightest form of homophobia. Like even if you're remotely homophobic, I can't have you in my life. Like I wouldn't want to have you in my life, because it'll be toxic for me. It'll be toxic for you, because I'll just be lashing out every 2 seconds. Then I think what the process was like for me, like internally, like it was a very liberating thing, because like I essentially just felt this weight lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time I could be my full self with the people who I loved and cared about, and I no longer felt like I was lying to them by pretending to be someone I was not, or at least like by withholding the whole truth. So I just went through that whole process of like just finding peace with with myself, and inviting other people to experience the fullness of Arize, not the airbrushed version. But then I don't think there would ever be a point in my life where I would feel an obligation to make a public announcement to the world. Oh, hello world. Yeah, it's never going to happen. I think like my approach to coming out is like on a need to know basis. Otherwise, you can figure it out for yourself.
Okay, that's generally kind of sheds light on certain things, and kind of leans into a question I had for Nigel. Then people need to educate themselves, right? And to some level, the movement is happening, and people are somewhat, at least they're looking at the headlines from the context within the first world in America and stuff. So I want to understand, where's like a point where people that aren't directly in the community, call it most dominantly predominantly heterosexual people, where's like the first place to start to educate themselves is getting in touch with people that they know.
The funny thing with a question like that, right, is that and this is highly indicative of a whole other matter that has to do that even can be seen when people are asking how white people can educate themselves on the Black Lives Matter movement and shit like that, right? Is that the easiest way to educate yourself, especially if you have the means, right? You know, for example, people in the Western world or people who have access to the podcast can do, the simplest way is to do a Google search, right? Is to literally just take time out of your day, spend like 30 minutes and just read, right? Because I didn't get to this level of information by like asking someone to like send me a whole list of things or ask someone to sit me down and lecture me for like 4 hours, right? I took time out of my day. I did my research. I listened to people's conversations. I read things online and I became more knowledgeable, right? Because it is not anyone's sole responsibility to educate you on something that you can do for yourself. If it was an extremely fringe matter where the knowledge was only being held by a specific group of people and you could only get this knowledge by asking someone who was within that group, right, then that would make sense. But at the point that the LGBT community's like global presence is at, is that if you did a Google search, right, you would find so many resources that you could educate yourself probably even further than the level that I am at without having to ask anyone for help, right? If you're looking for conversations that are being had online about the LGBT community, then follow more LGBT conscious people. Follow people who have these kinds of conversations daily, right? If you want to get more knowledgeable on things, go look for it, right? If you're looking for books to tell you about the history of the community, you could literally Google, right, LGBT history books, or you could find the people who are having these conversations, right, and see what books they're talking about. It's up to you to educate yourself, because once you have that knowledge, then I personally, for example, would be much more willing to sit down with you and talk to you about some things I might have missed, instead of asking me to explain years worth of knowledge and cultural understanding and implicit meanings to you.
Okay, that was a good few points that you said there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it leads to this question of what are some beliefs that you would suggest that heterosexual people have or comply to in order to effectively become allies to this LGBTQ plus community?
That's an interesting question you ask. The first thing that came to mind was to listen, right? And I'm gonna be making a lot of parallels between straight people and the LGBT community and white people and the Black Lives Matter movement, because of how many similarities there are. But
Okay.
the first thing that I would honestly have as a default, because I don't like making it a must or like a compliance kind of thing, but this is the one thing that I would put my foot down on, is that you have to listen before you speak. And you have to listen to those who are speaking before trying to speak on a matter that you may not necessarily fully understand or does not necessarily need you to speak on it when there are others who can speak on the matter, right? Because when, say, you're having a conversation with a group of your friends, and then someone who is in part of the conversation, who is actually part of the community, is trying to say something, and then you butt in with knowledge from like 3.5 articles that you read last night at 11 p.m. before going to bed, that does not help anything. That does not facilitate a useful conversation. That is you putting yourself in the spotlight because you think that having this little amount of knowledge makes you worthy of speaking on a matter that does not necessarily need you to speak on it. It is important to listen first and understand before trying to speak on a matter like this. Another kind of thing that I would like for heterosexual people to think about and to have on their minds while approaching LGBT concepts is to not take everything at face value and to not automatically believe everything that they're being told. I say this predominantly because of how vocal of a minority zoophiles and pedophiles are. There's actually a specific period of time when there's a big uproar about how people started thinking that LGBT people want to fuck dogs or fuck, they want to fuck kids, and it's because of how vocal of a minority that these people are. It is important to think for yourself and understand everything that is being told to you, right? And then this kind of leads me as well into the fact that I've been thinking about how we need a specific, structured, centralized point of information to have. So say, for example, classes and this kind of education about LGBT plus people in the community, I feel like should be had to some degree within schools, right? And of course, this kind of thing is once again tied into the whole understanding of schooling to do with sex education and to do with mental wellness. But the sooner we have these kind of conversations and the sooner that it is understood that these people exist, the better and easier it is that we will be able to have more constructive conversations that will actually lead to change, instead of you leaving a conversation and finish off feeling like you have done a lot when actually your lawmakers have not made that big of a change.
So I think if I could add on something to what you said, Nigel, is because I think you shared very fantastic points. But then I think the only thing that I'll add is that, while heterosexual people are going about learning, learning about the LGBTQ experience, it is also very important for them to, not just think about it as an intellectual exercise where it's kind of like you're learning about atoms, right? Because I think one thing that that I would like for straight and people to understand is that, these things are the lived experiences of people. Like, people go through shit on a day-to-day simply for being queer, and not neglecting that, like the human part of of the experience, and just thinking about it as as a purely intellectual exercise. Because I think that's what I've realized with how a lot of white people educate themselves about racism and slavery. Most times they educate themselves simply to build up their arsenal of argument points, right? And it's just very depressing to see, because like they essentially divorce the intellectual part, like they're learning, with like the actual lived experiences of people. But like I think we'll be able to make the most progress if these two things are combined.
Okay, that was a really good point that you said, and I think the way you mentioned education within it ties into a question that I'm thinking of right now. That at what point do you think that it would be useful to teach people about the LGBT, and what knowledge would you think is useful to teach about it? As you said that people could use information as arsenals. What information do you feel would be relevant to teach, to educate, and not to weaponize?
Yeah, I think it's even less about what we're teaching about the LGBTQ community. I think it's more about how we teach about it, because I think when people talk about including LGBTQ topics within like the larger sex education curriculum in schools, they think about it in the sense of creating like a separate subsect of of the curriculum to focus on the LGBTQ community. But then what they fail to realize is that they are inadvertently othering the LGBTQ community as like this separate group or this separate cohort of sexual deviants that like we need to understand, you know, to be able to help them to better integrate with society. I don't think that is how we should go about it. I think the same way that we teach about heterosexual sex, for example, in biology, like, you know, like something that is normal. We should use the same tone and voice to teach about queer sex, and I'm talking about queer sex very broadly, to, you know, to include gay sex, lesbian sex, and like I think where most of the education will even be impactful is from the family, because I think when we focus on learning about these things in school, we might fall prey to, you know, what I was talking about earlier, and, you know, in terms of thinking about it as like a purely intellectual exercise, because like when we're in school, we're in an academic environment, and like we think that what we're learning is, you know, purely academic and like meant for like intellectual development. But when we have these conversations at home, in our families, at our dining tables, I think that's where we would see the most progress, where people can think about the theory and also link the theory to a story to help them to like get like a well-rounded understanding of how people actually experience this. So I think it's even less about schools. So I think it's less about schools in the sense of like what we teach, but more about how we teach it. Then I think we can do a lot more with film, because I think film is such a powerful tool, because like I think it is one area where we can actually like visualize the lived experiences of people. So I think we're doing a lot of work, you know, like in terms of like telling queer stories in film, because it's helping to it's helping straight people to build empathy. But then like I think combining, you know, what we're learning in school, at home, and on TV, I think that's how we're going to make real progress.
Just one more follow-up question to that. How would we get the topic to the family? Because families might also have their own perspective on it. So how would we be able to get that into the families, to get families to talk about it? Because, you know, a lot of families say it's like not really that topic that you want to touch on very much.
Yeah.
So how would you get that?
I think we have already been doing that, and I think the easiest way is film, because I know the first time I had a conversation about about the whole LGBTQ thing with my mom was from a film that we watched, and that just kind of like led to a conversation about about that. And I think because I think typically in in the earlier stages, families tend to watch movies together every now and then, and I think while most African homes might skirt around the fact that, oh, these two guys on TV actually kissed, or oh, these two guys on TV actually had sex, I think when it's something that is that is repeated, or that is seen very often in film, it is definitely going to spark a conversation at some point. So I think that is the easiest way, and I think even queer queer and people themselves, because I think most queer, well, I'm thinking about myself now, because I know I'm going to have a bunch of like God kids, so God sons and God daughters, for example. I'm going to have these conversations with them. Like their parents are going to know I'm going to have this conversation with them, right? I like it, because like it isn't something that like I'm going to say, oh yeah, your parents must have spoken to you about about this. And like I think I'm thinking beyond the whole sexuality thing. And like I'm starting to learn a lot more about different ways of even romantic expression, because I think recently I've been fascinated with the idea of polyamory, right? And like it's something that I've been trying to learn a lot about, not necessarily to apply to like to my own life, but to be able to have a conversation with like people in my life who are considering that, or like if I have God, God kids who are, who are considering that, and like might need someone to talk to. So yeah, so like I think that is kind of like how I'm expanding like my own knowledge like beyond the queer community to be able to have these conversations within the families that I'll be lucky to be a part of.
Arize, you started a club on the campus at African Leadership University, Mauritius. You started a club called the Pride Plus, and it speaks to like celebrating everything that is about LGBTQ. Do you want to speak a little about why you started the club and what your like vision is for it?
Yeah. So essentially, like I started it because I felt like we hadn't had enough of a conversation about it on campus, and I think it was very disturbing, especially for a university that had diversity as one of its values, right? And I think most importantly, like the main trigger was, I'm looking at the experiences of some of my closeted queer friends on campus, and how they were struggling to navigate like the latent homophobia that that was on campus, and reflecting on that, like I realized that that latent homophobia existed because we weren't having as broad enough a conversation, and like I don't think ALU had made a strong enough stance in terms of like its position on on LGBTQ issues, because like my mind just kept going back to, I think this there's a talk that we had, I think like with the inaugural class in 2016 or so. I think it was the inaugural class and also the class of 2016. So I think it was like late 2016 where there was essentially this, I think there's this trans South African woman who came to talk about the whole LGBTQ thing, and she was essentially shouted down. Like it was just I think that seminar was just, each time I think about it, like it just brings back very horror memories, right? So creating Pride Plus was kind of like my attempt to bring back that conversation and be more forceful in creating a safe space for the queer community on campus, because honestly, like a lot of the impact that we've had with Pride Plus so far has actually been outside the sessions, because I think a bunch of people have reached out to me, people who I'd never spoken to, and like they would come to talk to me about how they're struggling with like their sexuality, and how they're how they're currently caught in this web of like sexual exploration, and like trying to reconcile that with like their faith, or trying to reconcile that with like the opinions of their friends. And I think there was this one conversation I had with somebody who was literally on the brink of suicide on campus, and this is something that probably their friends didn't even know. But like I think just the presence of Pride Plus and I think the visibility of the community on campus just kind of like made people start to think that like this is normal, like this is fine, like this is okay, and like they can actually speak about these things. And I'm fortunate that I'm fortunate to have Nigel as part of this conversation as well, because I think he probably also has some insights in terms of like how people responded to the sessions. So if so Nigel, like if you'd want to touch on that very briefly.
If anything, because I haven't had that as much exposure to people within the community on campus as much as you have, but I'd say that given from my observation of the sessions, it was more of, I could see the impact that creating a space for conversations had, right? I could see how, like, especially in people who like came back more often, right? They would become more comfortable and would even seek out some of the more delicate or more touchy conversations, and would be more willing to have these conversations in depth, a service level conversation, and then skirting around it and moving on with it, right? Because I do actually though look forward to continuing with the club and the society whenever we get back to campus. because that's something I would definitely like to see more of, and I would definitely like to actually be able to push for more campus-wide like administrative acknowledgement, and maybe even being able to bring in some speakers who could talk about what the LGBT community looks like on the ground in Africa right now. That's something I'd definitely love to be able to facilitate.
Amazing.
It's really awesome, guys. It's more like the foundation of figuring myself out in like the whole movement. So like figuring out where I sort of sit in that whole movement, and like the importance of like doing the homework, the importance of like trying to find out what it's about. Like I'm obviously assuming whoever's listening is like even cares to some level. So I really want to thank you guys, I guess so, for joining and speaking on this so well and articulate. I think there's a lot that's like that's there for us to learn from what you said, and like builds off of like a foreground for us to go into new learning and understanding about the topic as a whole. So I want to say thank you so much for those that have listened and have gone through and come through all the way to the end. We really appreciate you having listened. Would obviously just recommend that you still please give us feedback on this episode. Just engage with us on some of the things that were shared and your thoughts on them. And you can do this through our Instagram, mind_shack_. And I just want to thank you again, Nigel. Thank you, Arize, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Cheers and thank you.